Christian Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Early Christian Martyr Stories, an Evangelical Introduction with New Translations by Bryan M. Litfin. Narrated by Tyler Boss. Introduction. God, I want to surrender all my plans to you today. I want to give you the complete, utter control in my life. I want to lift you high above all else. If you are a Christian, you've probably prayed or sung words like these. Maybe you often whisper such things to God. What sentiments are being expressed here? Total abandon to the Lord's will, surrender of one's daily life to the all-wise God, earnest desire to testify to His glory. Admirable things, all of them. The person who wrote these words has set forth a worthy goal. But what makes them all the more powerful is that soon afterward, their author took 3 bullets in the face from a 7mm pistol because she was proclaiming Jesus in a place that didn't want him. I remember attending chapel in November 2002 when it was announced that American missionary Bonnie Witherall had been gunned down by a Muslim extremist. I was a new professor at Moody Bible Institute, so I had never had Bonnie in class like some of my colleagues. But soon we all knew her story. How she had moved to Sidon, Lebanon, to minister among the poor. How she worked in a prenatal clinic providing health care to local Muslim women. How she and her husband Gary knew international tensions were high, yet could not turn back from the call of God on their lives. A few weeks after the shooting, Gary came to speak at Moody. He didn't possess the charisma of a televangelist or the rhetoric of an orator, but he didn't need to. His message of Bonnie's profound faithfulness to Jesus Christ brought a flood of students to the front of the chapel as they renewed their commitment to God. Was Bonnie a martyr? She has been called one, and I will not argue with that designation. But my point in mentioning her story at the beginning of a book like this is not to trace an unbroken line from her experience back to the ancient church. You cannot put a toga and sandals on Bonnie or jeans and a t-shirt on Perpetua and consider them essentially the same person. Though both were young wives who relinquished their hopes of ease, security, and the joy of motherhood for the greater glory of God, their unique historical situations defy easy comparison. A very wide river, not just of time, but of spiritual outlook, separates the personal diaries that each woman left behind. Yet, for all their differences, I would argue at least one thing bridges the gulf between Bonnie and Perpetua: their total devotion to the Lord Jesus, who died and rose again. The purpose of the present book, then, must be twofold. On the one hand, it is supposed to be a work of historical scholarship. Early church history is my field of study, and it is both a privilege and a delight to offer a professor's expertise to my listeners. A lot of nonsense is tossed around in the popular media about the ancient church, but here, in this book, you have direct access to the texts themselves. The present work collects in a single volume the most significant primary texts about ancient Christian martyrdom, newly translated in an easy-to-digest style. I hope this enables you to investigate for yourself what the martyrs were all about. Yet in light of this book's subject, ancient Christians bearing witness to their Lord, a second important purpose cannot be overlooked. Like most accounts of martyrdoms from the earliest days to the present, my volume intends to inspire Christians to greater faithfulness. This is not to say every instance of ancient martyrdom can find a direct parallel in modern experience. Though Bonnie Witherall's murder or the pastor imprisoned for his faith by a foreign regime may resonate with the past, the church must not be too quick to develop a martyr complex. We can certainly expect to face opposition at times, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, but most Western Christians do not exist in a constant state of deadly persecution. My desire is not that we point to a certain person, place, or circumstance today and say, "Look, Christian persecution, pity us, just like the ancient church." Rather, I ask the listeners of this book to reflect on what it may mean to take up their cross and follow in the Lord's footsteps. For in the end, it is not death by leaping flames or gnashing fangs that binds the modern Christian to the ancient martyr. It is an unshakable resolve to follow hard after Jesus Christ at any cost. The age of martyrdom? As we begin to encounter the phenomenon of early Christian persecution, let us be clear about one thing. The ancient church period was not an age of martyrdom in the sense of continuous oppression and mistreatment. That is a myth historians have long rejected, though it has nonetheless crept into popular imagination. When a person today considers the ancient church, the image that often springs to mind is a crowd of toga-clad Christians in a Colosseum, their faces lifted to heaven as a steely-eyed lion approaches. Another common image would be a band of faithful believers scurrying into underground burial catacombs, while a Roman soldier with a red brush on his helmet searches in vain for his quarry. We must leave such romantic notions behind. Aside from the historical inaccuracies that all Romans wore togas, that the authorities didn't know where the Christians possessed cemeteries, that ceremonial helmet crests were worn on a daily basis, this imagery is problematic because it depicts the ancient period as an unbroken sequence of persecution. The truth of the matter is, open hostility to the faith was both localized and sporadic. Many decades passed when the church was entirely left alone, and at times it even flourished under broad popular support. So when exactly did persecution occur, and why? Roughly speaking, the phenomenon of ancient Christian persecution may be divided into three phases. During the first phase, persecution was disorganized and welled up according to local whims. In this period, it was occasionally sponsored by the Jewish authorities, as can be seen most clearly in the case of Saul. After Stephen's stoning, there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Acts chapter 8, verses 1 and 3. However, the Jews did not possess capital authority and so could not legally execute Christians. The focus of this book is therefore on Roman persecution, which was far more prevalent than anything coming out of Jewish circles. A noteworthy persecution from this earliest phase, one that set the pattern for future hostilities, occurred in AD 64 under Emperor Nero, who needed a scapegoat for a devastating urban fire in Rome. The historian Tacitus describes what happened. Nero therefore found culprits on whom he inflicted the most exotic punishments. These were people hated for their shameful offenses, whom the common people called Christians. The man who gave them their name, Christus, had been executed during the rule of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilatus. The pernicious superstition had been temporarily suppressed, but it was starting to break out again, not just in Judea, the starting point of that curse, but in Rome as well, where all that is abominable and shameful in the world flows together and gains popularity. And so, at first, those who confessed were apprehended, and subsequently on the disclosures they made, a huge number were found guilty, more because of their hatred of mankind than because they were arsonists. As they died, they were further subjected to insult. Covered with hides of wild beasts, they perished by being torn to pieces by dogs, or they would be fastened to crosses and, when daylight had gone, burned to provide lighting at night. Although this persecution was short-lived and did not extend beyond Rome, it nonetheless signaled that the state should be hostile toward the new faith. In the early 2nd century, the Church's experience of persecution moved into a second historical phase when Emperor Trajan issued a prohibition against Christianity. Though not a formally binding law, the letter from the emperor to his provincial governor Pliny seems to have set a legal precedent that later policymakers could follow. Pliny, often designated the Younger to distinguish him from his famous uncle, was governing Bithynia after AD 110 when he encountered Christianity for the first time. Accusations had been made, so Pliny presided over a trial. Those who admitted to being Christians were either executed on the spot or, in the case of citizens, sent to Rome for further adjudication. Those who denied the charge were asked to confirm their status as unbelievers by offering sacrifices to pagan idols and cursing the name of Christ. These are the actions Pliny asserts that no true Christian can be made to perform, and we will shortly examine their reasons for such reticence. What about those who formerly were Christians but claim to have abandoned their faith? Pliny asks for guidance in such cases. In response, Trajan lays down the policy that will prevail for the next 140 years. After commending Pliny for his wise actions, the emperor writes, "These people must not be hunted out. If they were brought before you and the charge against them is proved, they must be punished. But in the case of anyone who denies that he is a Christian and makes it clear that he is not by offering prayers to our gods, he is to be pardoned as a result of his repentance, however suspect his past conduct may be." With this imperial decree, the stage was set for local magistrates to bring the full force of Roman law against any Christian who came to public attention. Simply adhering to the name of Christianity was, in itself, a capital offense. The religion was now under state ban, even if its members weren't being sought out day after day. Whenever these scoundrels did turn up, they could be put to the sacrifice test and executed for refusal to comply. We should not think, however, that persecution in this era always emanated from the corridors of power in Rome. It often tended to be a knee-jerk response at various locations across the empire. Governors were given wide latitude under the Roman legal system to resolve cases as they saw fit. Torture and capital punishment were used at their discretion, including public execution by damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts in the arena. If the emperor's majesty appeared to be threatened, or if the local populace got together and complained against the alien religion in their midst, the governors were empowered to handle the situation by whatever means suited them. Usually they were tolerant and sought to protect the rights of Christians. Sometimes an evil spirit rose up, and the blood of the martyrs began to flow. The third phase of early church persecutions began under Emperor Decius in the year 250. What distinguishes this phase is an imperial policy to impose paganism throughout the empire. No longer would enforcement be reactionary. Persecution now came from the top as part of an empire-wide program. Reacting to the political instability that characterized the mid-3rd century, Decius decided a renewed commitment to Roman religion would be the glue that held his society together. His edict commanded all citizens to appear before local magistrates and honor the gods by actions such as pouring libations, burning incense, and tasting sacrificial meat. Upon performing this test of loyalty, the individual would receive a libellus, an affidavit that proved compliance. Though Christianity wasn't being singled out for unique persecution here, everyone knew this large religion was opposed to sacrifice and would be caught in the crosshairs. Decius himself presided over the execution of the prominent Roman bishop Fabian, possibly before the wider edict had even been issued. However, very few Christians held out like Fabian and became martyrs at this time. Some obtained libelli through bribery. Others laid low in their homes and hoped for the best, or fled to the countryside. And many just caved out to the pressure and sacrificed. When the persecution passed after about a year, the problem of what to do with those who had apostatized became a major issue. The Christian community was split, especially in North Africa, between those who wanted to offer forgiveness and those who claimed the church's purity couldn't be marred by sinful idol worshippers. Eventually, after much bitter acrimony, the more lenient view won the day. Decius's later successor Valerian renewed the persecution in 257, explicitly targeting the clergy and other Christians with high social rank. Fortunately, this effort was cut short when Valerian was captured by the Persians as a prisoner of war. The Church then entered a period of respite. In fact, under Emperor Gallienus in 260, Christianity became a legal religion for the first time, gaining freedom from interference and the right to own property. The Christians of that era believed a permanent peace had finally arrived. But it was not to be. In 303, Emperor Diocletian and others in his retinue initiated what has come to be called the Great Persecution. In some parts of the empire, it lasted only a few years, while in other provinces it raged for a decade. Many believers were tortured and executed in the most brutal fashion. Yet due to the complicated politics of that age, by the year 313, the fires of persecution had been snuffed out everywhere. The rise to power of Emperor Constantine solidified this reality and made a permanent end to Roman persecution. One historical source claims Licinius renewed persecution for a brief time when he had a falling out with Constantine, though this may be slander designed to tarnish Licinius's memory. When Constantine defeated him in 324, no other challengers remained, and the emperor could fully institute his policy of favoring the church. This great moment is symbolized by his letter, issued with his brother-in-law Licinius, in which universal toleration of Christians is commanded across the realm, the so-called Edict of Milan. The early church's age of martyrdom, which was not, as we have seen, a time of continuous persecution, but rather an era of its looming possibility, had finally come to a close. Yet the question begs to be answered. Why did it happen in the first place? A clash of worldviews. Sometimes in the old Western movies, two gunfighters will square off at high noon in the middle of a dusty street. A tumbleweed usually rolls between the enemies, then one of them will be heard to mutter around his cigarette, "This town ain't big enough for the both of us." What is the gunfighter saying? He is affirming in his own colloquial way that two irreconcilable forces have come into contact and one is going to have to give way to the other. The persecution of Christians was sort of like that. Two opposing worldviews had crashed into each other, both stubborn, both assertive, and both utterly convinced they were right. Unfortunately for the Christians, the other side held all the power for much of the ancient period. Examining the situation from the Roman point of view, we discover persecution was a complex phenomenon. It can be interpreted from a legal, political, cultural, or socio-economic perspective. However, the heart of the matter was religion. The Romans were not a secular people whose atheistic sensibilities were offended by the Christians' overt religiosity. Rather, the Romans prided themselves on their devotion to the gods. Historian Timothy Barnes describes the matter well when he writes, "Once it was realized that theirs was a new religion which entailed the abandonment of the established cults, the Christians could expect little sympathy or protection. The religious sentiments of the pagan world, if of a different type, were no less real and powerful than those of the Christians." Likewise, my own teacher and esteemed early church scholar Robert Wilkin writes, "Given this attitude that religion is a patrimony from the past which sustains the life of the state, it was inevitable that the piety of the persecutors would conflict with the new movement that had begun in Palestine. Everyone, from the superstitious masses to the educated elites, believed the rites of state religion actually accomplished something beneficial for the public welfare. And by this I do not simply mean people thought it was good to have quaint rituals from the past to maintain traditional morality and foster patriotism, as important as those things may be. The Romans believed real spiritual powers not only observed what humans did, they also controlled earthly events and could bring about blessings or disasters. From top to bottom, the members of this society accepted the existence of potent and capricious gods. This is not to say every single person believed in the gods. For example, a few of the philosophical schools were atheistic. Yet the culture of the Roman Empire was overwhelmingly religious, from the everyday commoners to the aristocrats who vied to occupy the prestigious priesthoods. The literary and archaeological records pour out a flood of evidence for Roman religiosity. Nobody should mess with powers like that. But the Christians did mess with them, and therein lies the reason for the gunfight. Of course, since there were many gods and many temples, it would not have been immediately obvious that an individual Christian was rejecting pagan religion. Personal devotion to a specific god wasn't demanded, so Christians could quietly avoid them all and go unnoticed for a while. Earliest Christianity was a small and secretive faith. However, one particular form of religious devotion that emerged in the 1st century AD became a sticking point because it was more difficult to hide: the cultural imperative to pay homage to the emperor's divinity in the imperial cult. The term cult here simply means a formal system of religious observance. The origins of the Roman imperial cult are diverse, with roots in Greek ruler worship and traditional Italian piety in which a clan's ancestral spirits were venerated. In any case, what emerged with Caesar Augustus and continued to expand after him was a full-blown religious system in which the innate power of the emperor received divine honor. Power was an amazing thing to ancient minds. Its generative source was something to revere, or even recoil from in awe. Since the emperors were the most dominant men in the world, their power must be especially fearsome and worthy of honor. Although the man himself was not, precisely speaking, worshipped in the original imperial cult, all citizens thought it useful to revere the spiritual entity called his genius, the personification of the emperor's power that supported his actions and allowed him to bless his realm. Devotion to the emperor's divine spirit soon became a central aspect of the broader state religion. This served as a very effective social adhesive. Festivals in honor of past and present emperors and their families rolled through an annual calendar that regulated the flow of civic life. Sacrifices and banquets were public affairs that knit the community together. Upper-class city fathers were expected to propagate the official apparatus of the imperial cult through donations and service as priests. Imperial provinces conquered by Rome began to celebrate their new Roman identity through this religious system. Emperor worship was also an important way to ensure the loyalty of soldiers in the army. In the Roman Empire, to spurn the gods, and especially the emperor's divine majesty, was to endanger the fabric of society itself. However, Christians did exactly this, and they couldn't conceive of doing otherwise. We must keep in mind that the roots of Christianity are in Judaism. Even when the church became predominantly Gentile, it never lost certain aspects of its Jewish origins. Although wide theological diversity existed in the early church, one thing was universally agreed upon: we are not polytheists. The words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, was just as important to the first Christians as to the Israelites. The ancient church fathers experienced gut-level revulsion at the paganism that oozed from every pore of their society. To bow to an idol, to pray to a god, to offer even just a pinch of incense to the emperor's genius, or in Greek his demon, was to deny everything for which a Christian stood. It was, indeed, to become a non-Christian. Though this might seem like extremist theology, a quick look at the early church's doctrine of salvation will help explain it. Many believers today are accustomed to think of salvation as being saved from their sins. An ancient Christian was more likely to think of being saved from the devil, which, of course, included being delivered from Satan's sinful bondage. This is clearly seen in the early Christian baptismal rite, which included a formal renunciation of Satan, an anointing with a special oil of exorcism, and rituals of transference from one domain to another. The devil was a powerful overlord who had enslaved humans to evil deeds, but Christ, the victor, entered his enemy's realm, defeated him, and freed his captives from sin and death. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. The Christian church was a community of spiritually emancipated slaves. How then could the followers of the true Lord of the universe pay homage to Rome's Caesar as a substitute Lord? How could those whom Christ redeemed from bondage return to the chains of idolatry? How could the foul demons who posed as gods receive worship alongside the risen one? To participate in Roman religion and its imperial cult was to spit in the face of Jesus. No Christian would do it willingly. Although many were not able to stand firm under the threat of heinous torture, those who did display such God-given fortitude were celebrated as the church's greatest witnesses, that is, as martyrs. The Greek word martys originally meant someone who gave eyewitness testimony in court or another public setting. In the New Testament, especially in Luke through Acts, the term carries the overtones of a person who confesses the gospel of Jesus Christ. Then, in the mid-2nd century, Christians began using the word to describe those who bore witness to the Lord through their words and deeds before a watching audience in the context of persecution. At this time, martys came to designate a person who died for his or her faith as the ultimate proof of firm conviction. Precedent for which can be found in Acts chapter 22, verse 20, Revelation chapter 2, verse 13, Revelation chapter 11, verses 3 and 7. All this to say, it was the collision of two religious worldviews that ultimately led to persecution, though this had a legal element as well. The Roman governors considered themselves to be prosecuting Christians as criminals before the law. The magistrates were trying to follow the normal, if somewhat jumbled, legislation against crimes like treason, injury to the emperor's majesty, sedition, meeting in secret clubs which were suspicious in principle, and disturbance of the peace by causing periodic civil commotions. The Christians weren't being singled out for special prosecution. The laws applied to everyone alike. On a few occasions, Christians were targeted directly under Nero in 64, Septimius Severus in 202, Maximus Thrax in 235, Valerian in 257, and Diocletian in 303. However, the Christians were normally subject to general legislation against private associations like theirs. Yet, what must not be missed here is that the laws that enhanced public welfare were thoroughly intertwined with the Roman understanding of the sacred. Legal prosecution cannot be bracketed off from religious persecution. The law itself was religious. It was designed to advance a particular cult system. That doesn't mean, of course, the trials of Christians were inquisitions into heresy. Roman religion didn't have doctrines of its own, so the magistrates cared little about the church's actual theology. Notice the judge's indifference in chapter 5 when Justin Martyr explains his doctrine of God and Christ. My point is simply that religion in Roman society affected every aspect of public and private life. The Christians were a political, social, and economic threat precisely because they did not support the ancestral customs of piety and devout social conduct. Maintenance of right relationships in both the human and divine spheres was what fostered the enduring peace of the gods. Everyone had a vital stake in that. The Christians' repudiation of their culture's values therefore constituted a real and present danger. The pagans often referred to them as atheists, people with no connection to the gods. Such individuals were like cancer cells on the face of a steadfastly religious society. Christianity was a superstitio, in the true Roman sense of the term, not just something to mock as ignorant, but a set of beliefs so antisocial it could only lead to deadly repercussions from the heavens. Consider these words from the great Roman statesman Cicero. Though he wasn't speaking about Christianity, later Romans certainly applied thoughts like these to the Christian superstitio. I thought that I should be rendering a great service both to myself and to my countrymen if I could tear this superstition up by the roots. But I want it distinctly understood that the destruction of superstition does not mean the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?